Okay, so we are down to the last couple lessons here for AP Gov. And it's exciting because after that was just preparation for the AP test. All right, so we're looking here, last couple cards, 323, 24th Amendment. So as the civil rights movement gets going, now Congress is starting to act. And that's what we're talking about today is what does Congress do to promote civil rights? We know the Supreme Court does Brown versus Board of Education, which is something we got coming up as a lesson, but we have now Congress acting. So 323, 24th Amendment. That's a real simple one. It was ratified in 1964, and it meant no more poll tax. Poll taxes were being used to keep African Americans from being able to vote. Since in the South, a wide percentage of African Americans were poor. So therefore, if you tax them, they didn't have the money in order to vote. And oftentimes with poll tax is that even if you ended up having the money, you had to pay poll tax going all the way back to whenever you turned 18 years old, and you had to back pay the tax. So that made it even less likely that someone would come out and vote. So this tax was the amendment which banned poll taxes was passed pretty quickly in 1964. And you can see the only state that rejected it was Mississippi. All right, moving on. That's the card. It's done. 324, 3.24, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is really the law that enforces the 14th Amendment. That probably should have been passed a long time prior to this, sadly, but it was almost 100 years later from the 14th Amendment. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was pretty big. Now, understand there were other civil rights acts prior to this. In fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, there was another one of 1960. They were pushed by the Republican administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Remember, African Americans had historically been a Republican constituency. And so there had been different Republican presidents who had kind of done some things for civil rights. Eisenhower, in particular, had done a lot. This is Richard Nixon here, the young Richard Nixon in a picture here, shaking hands with Martin Luther King Jr. Nixon was kind of the point man for the Eisenhower administration to push for the civil rights bill. But Democrats ended up filibustering it. A matter of fact, down below in the right hand corner, that's Strom Thurmond, and he actually filibustered for over 24 hours and actually wore like a basically he had wore what essentially is more or less a diaper, and had also gone and made sure he didn't drink anything. He basically dehydrated himself so he could filibuster for a longer time. And so this ended up passing, but it ended up getting watered down to the point where it wasn't really enforced, and that was the problem with it. It needed to be a more enforceable act. The 1964 version had those enforcements in place. And what had changed is that more Democrats supported civil rights than back in 1957. Republicans had supported civil rights, but now Democrats were kind of on board as well. And you can see from the vote here, 63% of House Democrats and 69% of House senators supported it. And on the Republican side, it was 80% and 82%. But this was more of a north-south split as well. If you look at the other numbers, Northern Republicans and Northern Democrats were fairly overwhelming in support of civil rights. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Democrat, ended up getting the Republicans on board, and he really pushed this through Congress. And Lyndon Baines Johnson was given a lot of credit, especially from the African American community, for pushing this and getting it passed. And it was absolutely landmark legislation. In 1964, you can see this Black Party identification, and you can see that into the 40s and even into the 50s, there was still a substantial amount of African Americans who voted for the Republican Party. And this is red, and the percent of vote for the Democrats is in blue. And there's still a pretty significant number of African Americans who voted for Republicans. And then in 1964, it really switched. And one of the reasons for that was Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee in 64. He was against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although he believed in civil rights and had actually voted for some other acts, he felt this act would be too expansive and give the federal government too much power. And but regardless of that, LBJ supported civil rights, and so you can see that African Americans had rewarded with loyalty voting for the Democrats at this point. And then you can see the numbers here change very substantially, and has been that way since. All right, justification was the Commerce Clause. A lot of the laws of discrimination were based on commerce and eating in restaurants and things like that, and buses. And so that's the justification for power under in the Constitution for Congress making this law. It banned segregation based on race, religion, or national origin in all public places. Banned segregation based on race, religion, or national origin in all public places. Perhaps most important, though, is that it created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So, this is a federal commission, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a place where you can file a complaint if you feel like you've been discriminated against, and the federal government can actually go in and enforce. If it was indeed a violation, then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission can actually enforce it. And you can see like all kinds of discrimination types here in pink: age, disability, on and on. There's a whole bunch of things here: sex, sexual harassment, and so on. So that's the Civil Rights Act. This is going to really ensure that African Americans are not discriminated against in public places anymore. All right, great. The last part of this lesson is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because there still were some voting things that were still going on that were denying African Americans the right to vote in the South. So 3.25 Voting Rights Act, of course, pause if you need to. First off, the 15th Amendment, a little review. The 15th Amendment, which is another one of the post-Civil War acts, gave the right to vote to blacks. And so this was huge. But the problem is that several states still violated the right for African Americans to vote. And here's what they did: they used literacy tests to stop blacks from voting. And in these literacy tests, sometimes were like you had to quote the Constitution verbatim. I mean, it was ridiculous things. And of course, white people couldn't do it either. So they couldn't have these literacy tests based on just blacks, because that would be discriminatory, and that's what it would violate the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. So what they would do is they would say they would have what was called a grandfather law. So if your grandfather had been able to vote, then you could vote, and that allowed poor whites to still vote. Now, in some states, poor whites didn't vote either. Like in South Carolina, you had a state that was equal to northern states like Iowa, and you only had 20,000 people voting in South Carolina. It was some really insane, distribution of votes. In some southern states it was really bad, but in some states they did the grandfather clause, so that way poor white people could still vote, but African Americans, of course, their grandparents couldn't vote, so therefore they couldn't either. And so the literacy tests were used in a very unfair way. In Selma, Alabama, 1965, blacks were beaten for registering to vote. This was seen on TV, and this really changed the United States, just like before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, where they had used fire hoses on African Americans, and that was on TV. This just really looks bad to these white people doing this to them. They're like, "We're just trying to register to vote, and you guys are like beating them. I mean, what is this?" And so this gives a lot of sympathy and a push to pass the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act ends up banning literacy tests. Remember, the 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. So now we're taking away barriers for African Americans to vote, and also included an enforcement measure, and that is federal oversight of voter registration to make sure that these states that had had these laws, most of them, of course, being in the South, that they are not violating the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this set of laws, the poll tax being banned, literacy tests being banned, and then the Civil Rights Act is going to give African Americans and ensure them civil rights by federal law. So Congress is acting here to take care of African American civil rights. Thanks.